My name is Lucy Hirschberger, and I am one of the owners of Forever Green. And today I'm going to be here and butterfly gardening. And we just were outside. I'm sorry, I have to find my presentation for you here. We were just outside butterfly garden on the what I guess north side of the library by the playground. And it's a nice little setup there, nice and sheltered, and I think the butterflies will love it. And they'll get a chance to, it'll be something that the kids and the visitors to the library will be able to see, especially as things start opening up. Said, my name's Lucy Hirschberger. I'm an owner at Forever Green, and I've actually been involved in butterfly gardening for probably the last 15 years. I got excited about it when I was invited to help with a butterfly garden in Iowa City, and we ended up with one at Forever Green, and I've just kind of grown from there into the gardening portion, but also in raising butterflies down at in our butterfly house. Like I said, I'm here today to talk about butterfly gardening and how we create a butterfly garden. And the main thing I always try to do when I start talking to people about butterfly gardening is make sure everybody kind of knows something about butterflies and their life cycle, because without understanding the life cycle of butterflies, we really kind of miss some of the points and the little things we can do in those gardens to really make them work. The first thing I always like to tell people is a butterfly garden can be something as small as one little container on your patio or as big as 100 acres of prairie. And the key to making it successful is really more thinking about the fact that you're creating habitat. And you're not only trying to attract butterflies, but you also want to provide something they need to survive. And one of the things that's happened in the last 5 to 10 years is people have started talking about monarchs and the migration and how amazing they are, which I agree with. But what people sometimes forget is there's actually 119 different species of butterfly in Iowa. And I just put a few of them up on the screen so you guys could get an idea of just some of the variety we have. A lot of these you may have seen. Often you don't see any of them because there's quite a few woodland butterflies that live here, and they're so well camouflaged, you really have to know what you're looking for to see them. But as we're planning our butterfly gardens, one of the things we really want to make sure is that we're considering all the life cycle stages of a butterfly. And at the risk of being a little obvious, for those of you who haven't thought about it recently, a butterfly actually has 4 life stages. They have the adult butterfly, the egg, the caterpillar, and then the chrysalis. And you can actually adapt your butterfly garden to help with all of those different stages. So I'm going to run through some facts about each stage that you can think about it while you're actually planting a garden. The first stage, of course, that I start with is always the adult stage. And one of the things about butterflies that a lot of people don't realize is they're very, very short-lived. On average, what we call big-winged butterflies in Iowa, like monarchs and swallowtails, things like that, the adult stage is going to live about 2 to 4 weeks. So they don't have a very long lifespan. And as you can see on that picture on the bottom right, and I'm sorry, it's a little blurrier, I didn't realize that, but that is what I would call an old butterfly. It's probably a couple weeks old. And if a butterfly lives that long and doesn't have a predator get cold and freeze to death, do so much damage to its wings that it can't fly at all, like if it gets hit by a car or something like that happens, at the end of their life, you're going to see their wings are faded and tattered, and they'll be flying kind of erratically. And all of that happens in that 2 to 4 weeks. The butterflies do have a ton of predators. They're eaten by other insects. They're eaten by birds. Even mice, snakes, and some other small mammals will eat butterflies. But when a butterfly hatches out of its chrysalis, its wings are going to be wet. It's going to hang to dry for just a couple hours. And as soon as it can fly, it has to go searching for food and water. So the first thing it does is look for the nourishment, food or water. The next thing it's going to do is look for a mate, because in 2 to 4 weeks, they have to breed and lay eggs, or find a mate and then make sure their eggs are laid in order to reproduce in that short period of time. But to find food, they can actually fly up to 200 feet up in the air. And they do see color, but they see color in ultraviolet rays rather than the way we see it. So if a butterfly is flying up at 100 or 200 feet in the air, it's flying around looking for food, and it will see patches of color down below that it recognizes as flowers. And that's how it knows that's where it's going to go down to feed. They also will land on a flower, and as most of us know by now, a butterfly doesn't eat like we do. It has what's called a proboscis. So all it can do is drink. It doesn't have the ability to chew or to bite anything off. So it'll unfurl its proboscis, stick it down into the flower, and drink the nectar. And that's actually how they also drink water. And they do need to drink water too. If a butterfly's wing gets damaged, if something happens, if an insect grabs them, or if they get blown into something in the wind, they can't repair that wing at all. So they'll always have that damage on their wing, and that can affect how they fly. The other thing about butterflies is the reason we're just starting to see them now is most of our Iowa butterflies can't fly if temperatures are below about 70 degrees. Like I said, they can fly 200 feet high, but they really can't fly in wind because, as you might assume, the wind's going to kind of buffet them around and could cause more damage to their wings. The rain doesn't hurt a butterfly, but they do need to shelter or to land when it rains, because the big droplets of rain can actually kind of knock them out of the sky like a missile. So they don't fly in the wind because they get blown around. They don't fly in the cold, and they don't fly at night. So if you think you see a butterfly at night, the chances are you're actually seeing a moth. The next stage that I talk about are the egg stage. And that is the goal of the adults out there, is to lay eggs. And if you look at the picture on the left, that's actually a monarch egg. And compared to the size of the needle, that's how small most of the eggs are. An adult butterfly like a monarch or some of the other big-winged butterflies can lay hundreds of eggs. Some of them will lay in clusters of 10 or 15 eggs, and some will lay an individual egg and lay them one at a time. And it can take them their whole life to get those eggs laid. The goal of a butterfly is to lay its egg on the host plant that its caterpillars will eat. So if a monarch, well, as we know, monarchs eat milkweed, and the monarch caterpillar has to hatch out of its egg on a milkweed plant or it won't have any food. So the female monarch butterfly will fly as far as she needs to find milkweed to lay her eggs on. And some of the other host plants we look at, the picture in the middle is actually a pipevine swallowtail, and it's laying its eggs on pipevine. Up on the top right is rue, which is another swallowtail host plant. And the egg stage is probably the most vulnerable to being eaten, particularly by spiders and ants. If an ant colony finds a plant with a lot of butterfly eggs on it, they're going to just go in and clean that whole plant off, and they'll eat every single egg that's laid. So the female butterfly will spread her eggs out as far as she can. Sometimes they'll lay 1 or 2 eggs on one plant and then fly to the next plant. And they'll do that 100 times in order to get all their eggs laid. The egg incubation period, I guess we'll call it, is typically 3 to 7 days, depending on temperatures. So those eggs are going to hatch out pretty quickly. And when the eggs hatch, or when the caterpillar hatches out of the egg, it's going to eat the egg shell, and it's the actual size of that egg. So if you look at the picture on the bottom left, you can see I've tried to point them out. The caterpillar that's on the far left that has the red arrow pointing at it is probably a day old. And in the 2 weeks that a caterpillar lives, they're going to grow 2,000 times their size they were when they hatched out. And all they do is eat, grow, and shed their skin and poop. They go through 5 growth stages where they shed their skin. We call those instar stages. Each stage is actually identifiable by the size and the type of antenna the caterpillars have. But these caterpillars are, we call it host specific. They are truly the pickiest eaters out there. I always reference the Hungry Hungry Caterpillar book, where they do nothing but eat and eat and eat and eat, which is true. But if it was written correctly, they would eat the same thing every day, which would make for a boring book. But a monarch caterpillar will only eat milkweed. A swallowtail caterpillar might only eat parsley. And if you move that caterpillar to a different kind of plant, they'll crawl off that plant and go crawling around looking for the host plant that they need, to the point where if they can't find it, they'll starve to death. So it's very important for a caterpillar to have that proper host plant so that it doesn't starve and they can feed all the way. I always put that picture on the bottom right to show people what nature can't do, which is have 8 or 10 monarch caterpillars eating on one plant. They would completely strip the plant. They'll run out of food and they could kill their host plant. And the goal is not to kill that plant, which is why the monarchs spread their eggs around. That's actually a picture out of our butterfly house where we have a dozen monarchs in a small contained space. As you can see, the caterpillars also have a lot of predators, other insects, birds. Actually, mice will also eat caterpillars. There's just a lot of things that will eat the caterpillars. So they've developed amazing techniques to protect themselves. One is what the monarch does, which is eat a plant that's poisonous, which makes them either taste bad or be poisonous to other insects. But one of my favorites is up on the top left, and that's a swallowtail caterpillar. And they have these little antennae that they can stick out. And those antennas smell like basically rotten meat, like garbage. And if they get scared or they feel like they're threatened, they'll put those antennas out and they put out this just terrible, terrible odor. And what that does is it makes a bird or a predator think that it's something dead and not something good to eat. And that gives them that little bit of protection to help them get through to adulthood. Once they've reached mature size, and again, it usually is within a couple weeks, they'll do their last skin shed. And that final skin shed is actually how they form their chrysalis. And you can see how that works in the bottom right-hand picture there with the monarch caterpillar. As it sheds its last skin, it pushes it up to the top. And then the outer coating of the chrysalis is the actual where the caterpillar is going to be inside there. And if you've ever pictured a chrysalis, most of us think about what's kind of in the center there, which is the monarch chrysalis. But one of the most intriguing ones in my mind are the two on the left, and both of those are swallowtail chrysalis. Excuse me. And they have the ability to not only mimic a leaf or a stick with the way they look to have just absolutely perfect camouflage, but a swallowtail chrysalis will match its surroundings. So one caterpillar might make a brown chrysalis if it's on a dead leaf or on a stick, whereas the other one, if it makes its chrysalis on a leaf, the chrysalis will be green. And so they've really adapted well enough to completely blend into the environment. An interesting thing happens once the chrysalis is made. If you picture in your mind how a caterpillar changes into a butterfly, I think most people are like I was, and they sort of think, well, it gets rid of a couple pairs of legs and grows wings and its body shrinks and it turns into a butterfly. But what happens is truly a metamorphosis. And the reason that is because the caterpillar uses its stomach acid to dissolve its body. And they dissolve the body into basically a green goo that has about 11 points or discs that contain the vital body parts, which might be wings, legs, heart, eyes, things like that. and then it will reform a new body around those body parts. So if you were to cut open a chrysalis a week or so after it was formed, what you would actually see is just this green slimy liquid, and it doesn't look like anything. And they just discovered how this works in the last probably 10 or 15 years when they started using ultrasound to evaluate chrysalis. So for most butterfly species, they're going to be in the chrysalis stage for probably 5 days to 2 weeks. There are some cases where that's going to last longer. And then as that butterfly is formed and fully developed, what'll happen is the wall of the chrysalis will start to get thinner and thinner. And you can see in that top right picture how that the wall has become so thin and clear that you can actually see the outline of the pattern on the wings. And once it's thin enough that the butterfly can break out, the butterfly will break out of that chrysalis, and its wings are wet. And I compare it to taking a sheet out of the washing machine. They're all crumpled up and wet, and that butterfly needs to hang for an hour or two in order for those wings to drape out and dry before it can fly. So at that point, it's kind of vulnerable, and it really needs to have that time where it's not bothered. So its wings fully unfurl. And if they don't unfurl all the way, or if it falls off its branch, it will never be able to fly and it won't survive. So that's kind of an outline of a butterfly's life cycle. So now if you take that information and you put it into creating a butterfly garden, the first thing I always like to talk about is food, because that's what I always focus on. And there's two things you need to feed in a butterfly garden. You want to attract butterflies with nectar plants, which of course also benefit bees and other pollinators. But you also want to remember that you have to feed those caterpillars, because if the caterpillars don't have host plants they can eat, then that's going to affect your garden in two ways. Number one, you reduce the number of butterflies available, but it also means, well, an adult female may come in to feed in your garden. She's going to leave to go find host plants to lay her eggs on. So when we talk about designing a butterfly garden, the first thing we want to think about is plants that have high nectar, but also plants that are going to produce nectar when the butterflies need that food, which typically for us in Iowa, we figure end of May through the end of September is when the butterflies are the most active. You're going to have a little bit before and a little bit after. But I always try to remind people, remember, you need to have that nectar source out there in the fall. That's when the swallowtails are laying their last set of eggs so that they can overwinter. And also when the monarchs are getting ready to migrate, and that migrator generation really needs a lot of energy before they take off. So if we think back to when I talked about the life stages and the adult monarch, if you remember, I said their wings don't repair themselves, and if the wings get broken, they really can't fly. One of the things they like to be able to do is, like in that top right-hand picture, they want to land on a flower without having to crawl through the foliage as much as possible. The smaller types of butterflies are fine to get down inside a plant, but for monarchs and swallowtails and the big wing butterflies, they really need to be able to land on top of the plant without taking a risk of damaging their wings. So we always try to pick plants where the flowers are held up above the foliage. In order to attract butterflies, because they are flying high, 200 feet or higher sometimes, and they can see color. If we plant in masses of color, they're more likely to see your area. So for example, the garden we planted outside is about 4 by 8, but we did 2 big groupings of annual flowers. We planted lantana and pentas, which are both great nectar sources. And I did 6 or 8 of those plants all together. So when they're mature and they start to really bloom, you'll have a big block of color there for the butterflies to see. And that way we can kind of draw them in, and then they'll nectar on whatever is there. Another important thing you want to think about is to have a variety of plants so you have season-long nectar for them. You may not have to have something blooming all the time, But if you can make sure you get all those seasons, you're going to catch those butterflies when they're hatching out. So for butterflies, you want masses of flowers. For host plants or for the caterpillars to feed, what you really want is individual plants. And I always tell people, if you put in a butterfly garden, like we did out back here with a 4x8 garden with lots of nectar sources, you can plant your host plants all around the yard. So you may choose, put 5 blooming plants all together to attract butterflies into your yard, and plant some milkweed or some parsley or any other of the host plants. You can plant those in different spots, maybe even front and backyard. And that butterfly will find those plants. They will be searching for what they need. And this is sort of my favorite list of butterfly plants. The more if you Google it or if you look at different lists, there is just lots and lots of different options. People always ask me, what's their favorite? What's the best color? Just all these questions. And what I found is I don't think they're as attracted to a particular color. A lot of people say, oh, monarchs like orange, and they do, but they also like red and yellow and blue. So it has more to do with the type of flower held up above, how much nectar that plant holds, and how available it is when they're looking for a food source. You can plant annual flowers, you can plant perennial flowers. There's also a lot of shrubs, as you can see. Butterfly bush, I think everybody's aware of, but lilacs and clethra and hydrangeas are all good nectar sources too. So those shrubs and trees also provide important shelter for those butterflies, because like I said, in the wind, butterflies can't fly. And when it's raining, they can't fly, and they need to seek shelter somewhere. And what they'll do is they'll crawl inside a bush or a tree where they're going to get a little protection from the wind and hang on to the branches. And they found that butterflies have little claws on their feet, and they can hang on tight enough that they can hang on to a branch in a 30-mile-an-hour wind. So it's important to have some kind of shelter for them. It also it allows them to feed more easily if it's on a breezy day. So any of these plants work. There's also a lot of other great options. And you'll notice up at the top on the left, I have written host plants. Again, your caterpillars are host specific, and most caterpillars choose different plants. And that's, if you think about that as a survival skill, if every caterpillar ate the same thing, they would all just eat all their host plant away and there would be nothing available. But when you start to look at the list, milkweeds, hollyhock, even clover and alfalfa, nettles, willows, there's probably 5 or 6 species of butterflies that use trees like elm trees and ash trees as their host plant. So if you plant a nice garden with plenty of food, you're going to be attracting butterflies, and you'll also be able to watch caterpillars as they grow somewhat. It's a lot harder than you'd think to spot a caterpillar. But there's some other things we always want to consider when we talk about creating a butterfly garden, and that's some of the other needs that butterflies have. And one of those is water. And we were talking earlier about, as we were planning the garden, we were talking about butterflies drinking and what's called puddling, which is drinking off the ground out of puddles, which really is probably their primary source of water. The garden is nice because, like in our butterfly house, we'll actually sprinkle some water on the foliage sometimes for the butterflies to drink. That would be kind of modeling after dew in the morning for them. And especially when it starts, the dew points go down and we don't have that morning dew. And if it's dry enough, we don't have water on the ground. What you can do in your garden area is go out and sprinkle some water on the foliage of your plants. I always tell people a butterfly garden is typically going to be a messy garden. We don't encourage watering the foliage, but that makes a big difference. You could also scrape your mulch back and expose some of the soil, or even a rock driveway if you have something like that, and you put water down on that. the scientists believe that butterflies get nutrients from the soil, some of the minerals that they need by drinking from the soil. So that's real valuable for them. The other thing you can consider is when I start talking, usually when I'm talking to a live group, the first thing people start doing is raising their hands when they ask me about, when I say butterflies only live 2 to 4 weeks, and they go, but wait, don't monarchs migrate and they fly to Mexico? And that's a whole nother talk, in all honesty. The migrating generation lives 3 to 6 months, just due to the conditions when they migrate. But most of the other butterflies we have in Iowa actually overwinter in Iowa. And that includes, for example, the swallowtails, which overwinter as a chrysalis. And when a caterpillar goes to make its chrysalis, it's going to crawl off of its host plant. And for the swallowtails, they're typically going to look for debris, either dead branches or a brush pile, somewhere where they feel like they're far enough away from their host plants, they won't be found by a predator, and they can camouflage in. So what they've done is the last generation of swallowtails, which is usually in October, lays their egg, and then that last generation will make a chrysalis that will overwinter in the chrysalis stage, and then they're hatching out about right now in the spring. But what we've tended to do is, in our desire to have a nice, neat yard and a clean garden, is we go out and cut down all the debris in our garden, either in the fall or early in the spring. And we don't necessarily realize that because we're doing that, we may be throwing away swallowtail chrysalis and stunting that first generation in the spring and limiting the number of butterflies we have. So what we're recommending is, if you're interested in having butterflies in your yard, we encourage people to delay doing any yard cleanup they're going to do until the temperatures start to get in the 70s. And I always say a good example is, if you start to see a few butterflies, the chrysalis have probably hatched out. So then it's a good time to go ahead and clean your garden up. The other thing we do in our butterfly garden is we usually leave a pile of debris just kind of laying there. And sometimes people look at it and go, well, somebody didn't clean the garden out. But what our goal is to provide that habitat for the swallowtails to put their chrysalis. I have pictures of lilacs on the bottom right. And the goal of that is to remind us that having trees and shrubs also provides that shelter for our butterflies. The top left-hand picture is a painted rock. But the reason I have that in there is, if you remember, I said butterflies can't fly when it's below 70 degrees. So sometimes when they come out in the morning, it's kind of chilly and they're stuck and they just can't fly. And what they'll do is they'll sit in a warm, sunny spot. And that's why we like the dark rocks. They absorb that sunlight and they add some warmth for them. And they'll open their wings up and let the sun warm their wings. And sometimes you'll even see them just vibrating their wing just a little bit. And that's to basically get the circulation out into their wings so that they can fly, so they can get moving. The bottom left-hand picture is just what it looks like, if you can tell. It's a piece of watermelon on some kind of a tray. And butterflies love fruit. There's actually some species of butterfly that will eat rotten fruit, or even they eat a lot of different things, but watermelon and oranges seem to be two of their favorites. So if you feel like you've got a lot of butterflies, or you want to attract butterflies, but you don't have you're either in a lull of flowers or you don't have a good source of food, you can put out a tray of fruit. Bananas is another one they like. And in general, the older the fruit is, the better they like it. So they want that little bit past its prime watermelon or banana. And it seems like that kind of sweeter smell will really draw it in. So that gives you an idea of some of the things you need to do to get a garden established. Another really important element to always consider is insecticides. And if you're using an insecticide in your garden, it's going to affect either the butterfly or the caterpillar stage at some point. The reason we say that is because insecticides are typically non-specific, meaning What might kill ants or Japanese beetles or anything else like that will also affect the caterpillar and the butterflies. So if you're going to treat with an insecticide, you want to be very careful to use it as minimally as possible, and preferably not on something that you're going to have butterflies land on. And my best example of that is we had a client call down to the garden center that had parsley growing, and they had caterpillars all over their parsley, and she needed to know what to treat that with to get rid of them because they were destroying her parsley. And luckily, the person she talked to happened to know that that's a host plant for swallowtails, and told her that, well, the swallowtails are probably what's eating your parsley, and so it might be nice to try to preserve those. She decided she needed her parsley for recipes, so she brought those into us, and we raised all the caterpillars for her. And her decision was the next year, since she wanted to have both butterflies and parsley, is she would just plant twice as much. And that way she could share it with the caterpillars. So just remember, if you see a funny looking bug on your plants, you never know what it might be. So it's always worth researching that just a little bit.
So would it be better to use like the natural, because I've seen people use oils and things as insecticides. Would those also potentially harm those?
They would also potentially harm caterpillars. So, and it's kind of a hard balance to pick. We call it non-specific. That's the technical term. So even if you spray Dawn detergent, which is a great non-chemical insect control, it's still going to it's going to plug up the breathing holes on both butterflies and caterpillars. The one advantage to using something like that is that it's a contact system. It's a contact insecticide. So it only harms things if you actually spray it on the insect. So a lot of times that's what we recommend, is if you're going to go out with go out with soap or something like that, if you're, especially for Japanese beetles, you can just go out and spray the actual bugs that are on there right then. And as long as you don't spray it on something else, it won't hurt them. So I think that's the end of my slides. I'm going to add some pictures of the garden we put in. I couldn't figure out how to get them off my phone into the computer. But does anybody else have any questions?
We've had lots of comments about how much people are learning.
Oh,
So they're very excited about that. I haven't seen too many questions yet. But you talked about shrubs. We just got one in. I'll come back to my question later.
Oh, okay.
We've got a couple now coming in. From Mickey, how do they mate?
Oh, so if you see two butterflies, they join at, I'm going to see if I've got, I really should have put that in. I'm used to doing stalks. That this kind of gives you a good example. You can see at the end of their body, at the end of their abdomen, they actually will join at the end of their abdomen. Typically, the male will still be able to fly when they're mating. So sometimes you'll see two butterflies join by the abdomen, and they'll be flying. They don't do it well, but they can. And they can sometimes stay joined for hours. So it's important that they can move around a little bit. And if I understand it correctly, most species of butterfly, the female will breed with multiple males. And like I mentioned, they can have 100 or 200 eggs, and they will hold those eggs until they're all fertilized. And then once they're all fertilized, then they'll start laying. I'll go up to my top picture here.
And so you gave a good explanation about why shrubs are important. Do long or like sturdy grasses help with that as well?
They do. Really, if you think about it, is anything a butterfly can land on and sort of climb into that's sturdy enough that it doesn't move around too much. They don't want to get in, inside, especially like a lot of the perennials that are more flexible. So if it's windy and they get inside there and the branches are moving and the leaves are flapping, there's more chance of those wings being damaged. So they like something that's kind of stiff. So the lower stems of a grass would work pretty well for them. That can also help break the wind in an area with flowers, so it's not as breezy when they're trying to feed, because even a 10 or 15 mile an hour wind is enough to kind of beat their wings around. So if they have a little bit of shelter, that'll help. So I mentioned that there's I think it's 119 species of butterflies in Iowa. And the smallest one is, I hate to do this, I want to point, is kind of in the bottom right hand, there's a big yellow butterfly, and then to its left, there's a little blue one. And interestingly enough, we call those blues. And those are probably about 1/2 to 3/4 inches in size. Their lifespan is less than a week. In the full life cycle, probably goes, for one that lives a long time, is about a 2-week life cycle. So they're really, really teeny, and they have a very short life cycle. Our biggest, I think, in the butterfly family is up in the top left. That's a giant swallowtail. And those you probably, if you see a big, huge yellow butterfly right now, they're hatching out. I saw one the other day. They're starting to hatch right now. And those can be 4 inches across from wingtip to wingtip, sometimes even bigger. Everything else is kind of in between. And I mentioned some of the woodland butterflies in the bottom left, kind of the 3 in the corner are 3 of my favorites. There's actually one called a kama, which is the furthest to the left. The one above that is a morning cloak, and the one at the bottom is its name just slipped my mind. But the eyes on its wings are actually a defensive mechanism, and that protects it, so it looks like it's bigger than it is, so that birds don't eat it. But the kamas, and also the one that's just to the right of the Forever Green logo, are all woodland butterflies. We have a comma and a question mark. And the morning cloaks and those guys are woodland butterflies. And one of the reasons you don't see those very often is just like in that picture, when they close their wings, they completely camouflage with the bark of trees. And where once you start looking at butterflies, I'll spot a monarch or a swallowtail, at 50 feet or 60 feet or further flying around, because it's open territory. But once you get into the woods where there's so many woodland species, there may be just as many butterflies in there, but you just can't see them. You can't see the butterfly from the trees. And as soon as they land, they're impossible to find because they're so well camouflaged. I always thought monarchs were orange because they camouflage themselves on the orange milkweed, so they weren't as noticeable, which is somewhat true. But I learned when I started doing tagging and I was out catching butterflies out in a pasture, that the best camouflage they actually have is when they close their wings, and especially in the fall when they're trying to migrate and you start to have masses of butterflies migrating together. Once they close that wing and they fly into a tree that's starting to get its fall color, and if you picture a cherry tree or something like that kind of gets yellow and orange with spots and a little bit of brown on it, as soon as those butterflies land in that tree and fold their wings up, they look exactly like a fall leaf. And they're perfectly camouflaged. And even if you watch them fly into that tree, they're hard to find. So it is kind of amazing how well they've adapted to that.
That is very cool. We do have one more question coming through here about how climate change is affecting butterflies.
It's affecting them in a lot of different ways, both climate change and development, particularly, again, we hear about the monarchs, how the forestation down in Mexico. They're destroying the rainforests, and the monarchs can only survive the winter when they go to certain areas of the rainforests high up in the mountains where the temperatures hover between 30 and 50 degrees and it's high humidity. If it gets too hot, it speeds up their life cycle and they can't survive the winter. If it's too cold, they freeze to death and fall onto the trees. So they rely on that exact temperature, and that makes a big difference. It also seems to me like we're starting to get the climate change is, in my mind, a lot of it is not so much it's getting warmer or it's getting colder, but we're getting these extremes in temperature, both the heavier rains and the hotter, drier periods. And in particular, if you look at spring and winter, what's kind of happening more and more is we're getting these really, just like we had a couple weeks ago, it was just really, really cold. And then we had 3 or 4 days of 80 degrees, and then it got really cold again. And for something like a swallowtail, where 80 degree temperature triggers that butterfly to hatch because it thinks it's going to have food and a reasonably warm environment. And then if it freezes just a few days later before it's had a chance to go through its life cycle, it can kill off that whole hatch of chrysalis. So that makes a big difference. A lot of it is habitat, probably as much as weather extremes. Again, they can't take the wind, they can't take those heavy rains, but they have to have a food source. So as we've started spraying weeds and cleaning up our yards more to have a better lawn, and farmers have quit having buffer zones in their fields, and they started farming fence row to fence row and mowing ditches, things like that, all just piece by piece sort of destroyed habitat. So what's really important, I think, with the resurgence of the monarch and the awareness of the monarchs is people are planting, they're leaving habitat and they're planting those host plants for the monarchs. But by starting to do that, it's also helped with the resurgence of some of the other species of butterfly. So hopefully things are going to start improving as we train ourselves better. So if you guys are interested in putting in butterfly gardens or just learning more and seeing more with butterflies, some of the things we do at Forever Green is we do offer, we do consulting and we help with design. If somebody wants to put in a butterfly garden, they can either go to our website and go to the garden center on our DIY button that we have and send us the information on your garden, how big it's going to be and kind of the exposure, fill out that form and send some pictures, and we can help you when you come into the garden center. We'll help you design what you want to put into your garden. I know we also offer other classes. We do have a butterfly house at Forever Green, which should be open this year. It's a 20 by 28 hoop house that's covered with shade cloth, and we stock it with butterflies. So you can come in and see butterflies in all their different stages. We also do a butterfly house, which we will have in some form at the fair, the Johnson County Fair this year, where you can go and see. I think we put in 150 butterflies, something like that, and work with the Johnson County Master Gardeners to do education, and they can talk to you about also planting a butterfly garden. So there's lots of great ways you can learn more and just kind of experience the butterflies. It's a free, but all of those are free. We don't charge for that type of thing. So you're welcome to come in and check it out. We will not have butterflies in our house until the end of May. Again, because we're waiting for that warmer weather to make sure we don't get them in and then have them freeze. So.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucy, and everybody here who has joined us for this awesome presentation. We will go ahead and we'll share this. This will be shared out to Facebook, and so you guys can come back and rewatch if you forgot to take notes or anything. And of course, you can always reach out to Forever Green, and we'll share some of those pictures we took of the garden. And yeah, whenever you are ready, I'm not seeing any more last minute questions flood through. So we'll see you all next week. Thanks for joining.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.